Good.
This works.
Good morning, everyone. Glad to see all of our task force members joining the meeting this morning. We're going to give it a few more minutes and then we'll get started here shortly. Thank you very much.
For me to start working with.
Hi, Stephanie. Can you hear me?
Yes, good morning. I can hear you.
Okay, cool. Gotcha.
Great.
Hi, Stephanie. This is Michelle. I got in.
Okay, great. I was just trying to figure that out. Thanks, Michelle. All right, it looks like folks are still joining, but I think we can go ahead and get started now. I wanted to see if we can begin with an invocation. Jose Viejas, Chaplain Viejas, if you wouldn't mind opening us with a prayer. And just so everyone knows, as you're entering the room, we're just muting everyone. If you need to unmute, go ahead and unmute yourself, but we're just automatically going to mute everyone as you get into the room this morning. So thank you all, good morning, and I'm going to hand it over to Mr. Jose Viejas.
Buenos días de la Dios, Amani Boteni Bonewe, and good morning. Great Spirit, come to us with the power of the North. Make us courageous to walk the sacred path. Give strength and endurance to do that we are called to do during our life, especially in times of trials and adversity. Spirit of light, come to us out of the East, the place of new beginnings and promise, with the power of the rising sun, announcing a new day. You give us hope. Let there be joy in our words, just as you gave the spiritual gift of new life to all Native people. Great Spirit, send us the warmth and soothing winds of your healing medicine from the south. You are the gentle rain that brings forth the seed of life. Enable us to hear prophetic voices around us. Grant us, God, our Creator's love, amor, compassion, and healing power among our people. Spirit of life, we face you in the direction of the West. Help us to be bearers of your word. May we be voices of life and hope to all peoples, nations, races, and beliefs. Together we will rise. Para Dios todo la gloria, para lo que aman a Dios. Todos es para bien, porque tú eres, oh Dios, mi fortaleza. Sea por amor de Dios, for the love of God, our Creator, acknowledging you on this day, we pray. Amen.
Thank you, Chaplain Viejas, for that invocation. And at this point, I will turn it over to our Chair, Secretary Lynn Trujillo. Thank you all.
Kinamopio Kademba, everyone. Good morning and welcome. I want to thank you, Chaplain Viejas, for that invocation. For those of you who don't know the chaplain, he's a member of the Texas Band of Yaqui Indians. He also serves as a police chaplain and is a member of the Southwest Intertribal Emergency Managers Coalition. Chaplain Viejas has been instrumental in the passage of House Bill 278, which created our initial MMIWR task force in 2019. And we really appreciate his continued support and assistance to the Indian Affairs Department in this task force. Herkem, Chaplain Viejas. I also want to thank the task force members and the presenters who are joining us today and guests for being with us. Since we don't have a formal break in the agenda, we want to encourage you to step away as needed, to take care of yourself. We want to make sure that if you feel triggered at any point, we really encourage you to reach out for help. The staff of the Indian Affairs Department has included several counseling resources in the chat box. And so we are gathered here today for the countless women, men, children, elders, and our two-spirit relatives who we've lost, but and those who are still finding their way back home. And we think of you today and every day in our work, and we pray for your safe return home. We pray for your healing. Since our last meeting on the July 29th, Each subcommittee has met and has started to review and discuss each of the recommendations in the 2020 MMIWR final report to determine how each recommendation can be implemented by the state of New Mexico, and to identify what actions, resources, and partnerships will be necessary to make these recommendations reality. We know that this is a necessary step towards healing our communities by addressing policies and resource gaps that must be addressed to ensure that response efforts, reporting, and the pursuit of justice is clear, swift, and immediate. And the purpose of developing an MMIWR state response plan is to provide stability, direction, and funding to this important work. The state response plan will guide our MMIWR work by outlining objectives, timeframes, and partnerships. So I really want to thank all of you on the subcommittees who have been working extremely hard outside of the main meeting times that we've been coming together. Since this task force was established, there's been many offers to assist and support the task force, which come to us regularly. And I want to say thank you. We take each offer of assistance seriously and consider how we can incorporate each opportunity into our work. And today we have 2 informational presentations that align with our work and may be a resource for the task force and our communities. First, we'll hear from Albany Burns, who is a prosecutor for the King County Prosecuting Office in Seattle, Washington. Albany was also a former law enforcement officer here in New Mexico before she went to law school. Albany will talk about efforts underway in King County to revamp their databases and improve data collection. In addition, she will speak about trainings that were developed for law enforcement and public safety officials in collaboration with the Urban Indian Health Institute. After that presentation, we will hear from the Bernalillo County District Attorney, Raul Torres, about a MMIWR cold case unit that he would like to establish within the Bernalillo County District Attorney's Office. This is really an exciting opportunity, and we hope that with the assistance of everyone here that we can offer guidance and feedback to District Attorney Torres. Finally, we will end today's meeting with a brief 10-minute report out from each of our subcommittee chairs with 10 minutes allocated for questions and discussions. So we have a full agenda, but a really good agenda here. We'll wrap up the meeting with announcements and next steps. And with that, again, I want to welcome all of you to this meeting, and I will now turn it over to Stephanie to introduce our first presenter. Thanks, Stephanie.
Thank you. All right, good morning, everyone. It's great to see you all. As I stated earlier, I am going to start by introducing Albany Burns, who is, she used to be my TA in PLSI, and here we are. So Albany Burns is an enrolled member and enrolled citizen of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma and Senior Deputy Prosecuting Attorney at the King County Prosecuting Attorney's Office, currently working as a trial attorney in the Sexually Violent Predator Unit. Albany began her career at the King County Prosecuting Attorney's Office in 2013 after a career in law enforcement in New Mexico. She has prosecuted a wide variety of cases, including homicides, rapes, child abuse, and assaults. She has spent her career advocating for victims of violence with a focus on gender-based violence. Albany has provided trainings, CLEs, and educational presentations to law enforcement and attorneys in Washington and New Mexico. She has been a guest presenter at classes and events at numerous law schools in the Pacific Northwest area and beyond. Albany has presented on the topic of MMIWR, GP, and prosecutorial responses to the crisis at law schools, symposiums, and statewide CLEs. She has been consulted by attorneys and leaders across Washington, New Mexico, and beyond on this topic. Albany is also a member of the newly formed Washington MMIWG task force. Albany developed a partnership between the Urban Indian Health Institute and the KCPAO, resulting in a complete rehaul of data collection and sharing of demographic data collected by the King County Prosecuting Attorney's Office. As part of this partnership, she also brought training to the King County Prosecuting Office to educate attorneys and staff about the jurisdictional gaps affecting Native women, historical trauma, tribal sovereignty, and government-to-government relations and communication with tribal sovereign nations. Again, Albany is a friend and a colleague, and I'm really happy to turn it over to her this morning and give her the floor to present to all of us this morning. So thank you, Albany, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. It's good to see your face. I'm going to share my screen. I have a little PowerPoint. Can folks see that? Okay.
Yes.
So good morning again. Thank you, Stephanie, for the introduction. Since this is a Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Relatives Task Force, I'm really happy to be talking to a group that really understands that this is a national crisis. I'm very thankful and very honored to be speaking to this group. You're truly leading the way nationally. And so thank you, Secretary Trujillo. Thank you, Ms. Salazar. Thank you for inviting me here today. And thank you for everyone that's working so hard on this task force and has been for longer than most other states. Like Stephanie said, my name is Avani Burns. I'm a Senior Deputy Prosecuting Attorney with the King County Prosecuting Attorney's Office. That's a mouthful, but that's the county that contains Seattle, Redmond, Bellevue, and lots of other cities within it. We have about 39 different law enforcement offices, agencies writing into our office, sending felonies to our office. I work as a trial attorney or sexually violent predator unit. It's focusing on civil commitment of sexually violent predators, but I've done a whole bunch of other work in the office that's Stephanie's already gone over. Most importantly, I was born and raised in New Mexico. I'm an enrolled member of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. My dad lives back in Oklahoma, but my mother and grandmother and sister are all now in New Mexico still. I attended UNM for undergrad and for law school and for PLSI with Stephanie. And so while I live in Washington, I'm a lifelong New Mexican, and hopefully we'll be able to come home one day. I'm here to talk to you about my work as a prosecutor, but as Stephanie said, I want to disclose and tell you up front that prior to law school, I was a law enforcement officer in New Mexico. I worked for the New Mexico Department of Public Safety, and I also worked for MNRD as a law enforcement officer in the Parks Division. I worked in all four corners of the state. So for me, New Mexico law enforcement officers and the work they do is top notch, especially after seeing other states do it. So I'm really excited that there's so many law enforcement agencies involved in this task force. That gives me a lot of hope for the work you guys are doing. So let's get started. I want to be clear up front of what I am and what I'm not. I'm just a trial attorney. I'm not a researcher. I'm not a statistician. I'm not a data expert. And I'm not really an expert on the broader missing and murdered Indigenous women and relatives crisis. I'm just a trial attorney who knows how to find experts and make connections. So I'm here to talk to you and give you an overview about what my office, the King County Prosecuting Attorney specifically, has done as a response to the crisis. You're all aware of the crisis, and we're here today because you are also planning and already planning and doing actions in your communities to combat this crisis. So some topics that we'll cover today are listed here. It will be a presentation about our office's process of revamping how we collect demographic data. It started with an internal look at our data, our recognition of our failures, and a community partnership with the Urban Indian Health Institute that has led to data collection changes, data storage changes, data sharing changes, and an office-wide training series that is ongoing and I hope will continue indefinitely. We're going to talk about how the partnership came to be with UIHI, with the community here in King County, and our internal process of change, because it's taken an internal process of change. And that includes getting leadership buy-in, tribal consultations with the Muckleshoot Indian tribe, and a forthcoming MOU, the development of a public dashboard for data related to this, as well as the training of our employees in the development and strengthening of our community networks and educating law enforcement. So when I refer in this presentation to PAO, I mean my office, where I'm a prosecutor, the King County Prosecuting Attorney's Office. When I say UIH, I mean the Urban Indian Health Institute. WSP stands for Washington State Patrol, and SPD is the Seattle Police Department. the next one. So to talk about our response, I want to start sort of going back. Washington State Patrol and the UIHI released a series of reports in recent years related to data and the crisis and the invisibility of Native women in the criminal justice system. I'm providing Stephanie Salazar a link to all of these reports so that anyone can look at them and review them at the end if they want. But you're also welcome to contact me directly. These reports and their exposure of the alarming lack of data related to Native victims of violence and the MMIW in general were the reason that our office began a data modernization and training curriculum for our employees through a partnership with the Urban Indian Health Institute. Essentially, Native women are invisible in the data, and we need to change that. So to talk about our response, I want to give you a little background on how we developed this relationship with UIHI, because when we're in meetings like these, discussing the criminal justice system and the MMIWR crisis, we mostly talk about macro level things, right? Big things, trends in data, gaps in data, caseloads, jurisdictional disputes, the larger impacts of case law, policy, et cetera, et cetera. These are big macro level things, and it's easy to forget about the reality of what we do in the day-to-day, the person-to-person interactions and impacts we have as working in the criminal justice system. And for me, it's really important that we center every time we talk about this crisis on one person, right? Because every missing person, everyone that's gone or that we don't know where she is, she's someone's daughter. She may be someone's sister. She may be someone's mother or auntie or even grandma. So we need to really keep that in the forefront of our minds that this is a human to human interaction that we have, and we're doing this work to make it better for our sisters, our mothers, our daughters. So I want to start on a micro level with one missing victim. We're going to talk about all the data collection and the numbers, of course, but because I'm a trial attorney and a storyteller, I want us to center, like I said, upfront and talk about one case and why and focus on the number one. And that number one is Debbie. She's one missing victim of mine. Our relationship with UIHI and our response to the data issues surrounding it, it all started for me with one case and the one missing sexual assault victim. I'll tell you up front, this isn't a story with a happy ending. Like most criminal law cases, we'll have a defendant, a detective, and a victim. The defendant was a non-Native man, a very violent man, well known to the Seattle Police Department officers. He's a known man that is a predator of homeless and vulnerable women. He picked these women because it was easy to commit acts of sexual violence on them. Women with no homes, with problems such as untreated mental health, substance abuse disorders, many things that caught them up in the criminal system as well. Victims that make it hard to prosecute cases against people like him. He's our defendant. Our detective is the Seattle Police Department Sexual Assault Unit Detective Anthony Belgard. We call him Tony. Tony's the type of detective that a prosecutor wants assigned to cases. He's dogged, he's smart, and he's a detective that never gives up. And in this case, he continues to this day to track both this defendant and his criminal activity, but he also continues to search for Debbie because he truly cares about victims, and especially the most vulnerable victims in Seattle. And so we go to our victim. We're calling her Debbie. That's not her name. I'm not going to list her tribal specifics or case details just to protect her. What I can tell you is that Debbie was a Native American woman in her 40s, and she surfaced in the Pacific Northwest about 2010. We know she's from a tribe far outside of Washington, just based on info that Tony was able to find trying to track her down. What's important to know about Debbie in the context of data and the importance of it for today's presentation is that she wasn't a stranger to gender-based violence. At the time our case started a few years back, she had at least five prior protection orders, 4 for DV, 1 for sexual assault, all in Western Washington. The case I was prosecuting was not her first time dealing with police or the system as a victim. And another thing to note is she's also had very minor run-ins in various municipal courts throughout Western Washington counties as well. So she's hitting data points all along the way in the system. And she was known to the South End officers just the same as they knew of this defendant, but they knew that she was a homeless woman and they had contact with her on occasion at the local shelter. And so Debbie was attacked one night in public near a transit station, and a Good Samaritan heard her screaming and was able to intervene and catch and hold the defendant for police to come. And that's something that's rare in cases like this. But he was charged with felony sex crimes. By the time I got the case, Debbie was gone. I never even met Debbie. She was in the wind, nowhere to be found. And Tony, the detective, searched everywhere for months trying to find her for trial. We didn't know exactly where she was lost from. We didn't know if she was missing from somewhere, if she was fleeing violence from somewhere else. We didn't know anything other than what we could see in data systems. And that's important to keep in mind, the data systems that we work in. So Tony had every officer in Seattle and the South and looking for her. He was regularly searching through our homeless encampments, checking local shelters, popping in almost daily to the Chief Seattle shelter to ask around. We didn't know much, but what we did know was that she was someone's daughter and that she had been attacked by a known predator in our city. And so we kept looking. And so as trial neared, I continued to try to think of ways that I could find this woman. I was desperate because this man will no doubt attack again. And so in desperate, I started going through my Rolodex, my PLSI contacts, and I was able to get a contact for Abigail Echohawk. Around that time, her first report on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls had just been released. So I knew who she was and reached out hoping she had ideas that I hadn't thought of yet. She put me in touch with folks at the Cedar Rising Coalition. It's a group of Native women in various fields working on gender-based violence issues and the MMIWR crisis that have come together, trying to make a difference and address these issues on a grassroots level just in Western Washington. But even with those connections and searching, we never found Debbie. I don't know if she's gone back to the Midwest. We don't know where she is, but our case fell apart and we never found her. And for those of you in here that are police or prosecutors in this meeting this morning, I'm sure something similar may have happened to you too. And again, this is a group I don't have to educate about the fact that there is a crisis. So I want to focus on our steps now that we've sort of put this into perspective that this affects people, right? And focus on our steps as a county prosecuting office to try to build a network and a community to try to combat not just the crimes that Debbie was a victim of, but also combat reasons and situations in our jurisdiction that left Debbie vulnerable to a predator's attack that night. Now, our response is forward-looking, targeted at ways to focus attention and hopefully resources, most importantly, for the underlying reasons that may leave Native women and girls and relatives vulnerable to something like this. I said earlier that the first UIHI report dropped early in Debbie's case. I'd shared it in my office, wanting other people to read it. Now, fast forward several seasons later, we'd begun working on a data modernization system internally. We had a powerful new software system that we'd purchased a few years prior, and we were really trying to figure out how we could harness the power of this system and see if it's something that could help us better allocate resources, essentially. Then the Washington State Patrol report on MMIW dropped, and that got some attention in our office as well. We began discussing the crisis internally, and soon after that Washington State Patrol report dropped, the UIHI response to the Washington State Patrol report dropped, and that's called We Demand More. And I really want folks to read it if they can. Those reports really shook us. They exposed data gaps and had startling insight into our own jurisdiction that we had not yet realized, and specifically that Native women were invisible in our systems here. And so just some of the stats that were alarming from this report, I put on the PowerPoint right here. These stats highlight the failures locally in the Seattle King County area. This is from the UIHI's Our Bodies, Our Stories report. There's 3 total reports. These are issues that identified that contribute to the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls crisis. Think about each of these in terms of data and resource allocation needs. So 94% had been raped or coerced in their lifetime. 42% of victims of rape or coercion had attempted suicide in their lifetime. So we're talking about mental health concerns. We're talking about victim response concerns. 53% lacked permanent housing. We have a huge homelessness population here, an unhoused population. We have alcohol and substance abuse problems. But most concerning to prosecutors for us of particular note was that 8% conviction rate. When you see an 8% conviction rate and you're a prosecuting attorney in sexual assault, it's hard to take, right? It's clear that we were failing our Native community. I'll go to the next slide here. And so when we look at those reports, especially starting with the MMIWR report. They had identified 506 cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women. And these were the missing folks. And the cities that figured most prominently in the data were Albuquerque and Seattle. And when you look at the top 2 states in that study that they did, the top 2 states are New Mexico and Washington. And so for me, it was like a gut punch to read. I was then a sex crimes prosecutor in Seattle. I'd been a police officer living in Albuquerque. I'm a member of a tribe. This is just horrible. This is failure on so many levels. And so it was horrible to read, right? And so while it was a gut punch to me, it was also a gut punch to my colleagues. Seeing the UIHI reports and knowing just how prevalent the issue is here in Western Washington was really the wake-up call we needed to know we had to do better. And so we sat down together, the head of the domestic violence unit, our sexual assault unit supervisor, who was my boss at the time, and a few other people working at our Children's Justice Center. And we started looking internally at our own numbers to try to see where the gaps in the data identified by UIHI could be corrected on our end. And so we laid a simple plan to try to address this. We would educate ourselves, we would try to change our practices and policies, and we would reach out and connect and build trust with the communities we were serving. And that's easy to list, but it takes a lot of work. And these are all ongoing things that we're doing, all 3 of these. To give you a little background about our jurisdiction here in Washington, I've put a couple maps. These aren't my maps, I've taken them from the internet, but King County is located in Western Washington. It's where Seattle is. And like New Mexico, there are many sovereign tribal nations. There are 29 here, federally recognized tribes. And we specifically share jurisdiction with the Muckleshoot Indian tribe. If you look at the one on the right, you'll see that lighter color of green is all of King County, and the Muckleshoot tribe are those red dots there. So you have some checkerboard issues in jurisdictional gaps, the same as you would in New Mexico. And something that's important to note for Washington, but also in New Mexico, because you experience this as well, it's those jurisdictional gaps is often where victims fall through the cracks, right? Where we fail victims is in those jurisdictional gaps. So our office specifically, like I said, we have 39 different police agencies writing into our office. When I say writing in, I mean referring crimes to us to prosecute. And that's huge. We're a large urban and rural area. I've heard people say that we're the size, both physically and population-wise, as the state of Rhode Island. We have a jurisdiction that encompasses tribal lands, farms, large cities, coastal regions, rural areas. It's almost like a little state on its own. And like New Mexico in certain ways, because we have victims come from all over. We have officers, police officers, prosecutors engaging with Native people, not just from the Muckleshoot tribe or even Washington tribes in general, but from all over the country. We're a hub for Native people. I like to think to SIPI, to Gathering of Nations, state fairs, any sort of the art school in Santa Fe. Anytime you have a hub for Native people, you're going to have Native people being victimized by the state that they're in, right? And so that is a hub that I think of New Mexico, I think of Seattle, I think of places like Duluth, Phoenix, Denver, places where people come in an urban environment, but have a larger population of Native people than other places, say like Atlanta. And so when we look at our population, 1% of our population is Indigenous peoples. And that may not seem like a lot, but 1% of about 2 million people here is like 22,000 people. And so putting that in perspective, that's like we have the whole town of Gallup within our jurisdiction, that size of a population of Indigenous people. And so we really need to step up what we're doing because we're failing here. And so these are the list of the reports. There's 3 total UIHI reports in the Washington State Patrol report that we really looked at and tried to suck in and learn from. And as we started learning from these reports, we learned about the violent victimization of Native women. First, we learned from those reports that monetary value has been assigned to Native American women, and they're treated like property. The geographical location of Washington, it borders Canada, and there's a heavy use of ports. It cultivates an environment that attracts human trafficking activity, and a lack of data exacerbates human trafficking, right? We look at the lack of proper data collection. We know that little to no data existed due to lack of engagement and response from local law enforcement when attempting to report loved ones as missing. I know you guys have done a lot of work on the NamUs and looking at the systems there and reporting. Many law enforcement agencies do not take reports because of perceived reputations of drug and alcohol issues, criminal history, mental health. If data does exist, the data isn't complete. Racial misclassifications result in underestimates of the American Indian Alaska Native populations here. 45% of American Indian Alaska Natives self-identify as American Indian and Alaska Native, but also with another race, so a multi-identification of races. And we're not capturing multi-race individuals in our data. And that has an impact on resource allocations. And that's something that we're really focused on in this is resource allocations. Another thing to look at is the lack of coherent structural response. Many reservations fall under multiple jurisdictions. In Washington, it's a PL 280 state, which is different than New Mexico. And there's a lack of coordination between tribal, state, and federal agencies. And that's something that we're really working on locally to build those bridges. And so what that means is it's not always clear who will handle investigations and who family members could get answers from when a loved one or a relative goes missing. When we look at the We Demand More, Abigail Echohawk wrote a letter in the beginning of that report, and it really weighed heavily on us. And it said, if that first one is not done well, which we just witnessed with the Washington State Patrol's recent MMIWG report, history shows us we see these subpar efforts mimicked throughout the country. And so as a large office, we have a lot of leverage in the state, and we wanted to do things right. You know, we want to do things based on good data and science. We're a huge office, and we're in a position to lead if we do things right. And so we started an internal assessment. We started looking at the correlations and what we were missing. Our business is gender-based violence, really. That's what I focus my career on. And it was clear from those reports that there's a correlation between gender-based violence and missing and murdered Indigenous women, and that there's a lot of missing info. When we did an internal look inside, we had huge spaces missing. Things we know as prosecutors, just from doing the work, historically marginalized populations and people of color, Native peoples, both victims and offenders, are affected by crime at a significantly higher rate than other populations. And so we looked at our internal data, and we know the data we didn't have. It's a lot, and it should be easy to grab, right? We have access to these data sources, but have not developed a system to really capture it. And this affects not just the MMIWG issues here in King County, but it affects a whole variety of other populations. We serve victims in one of the most diverse populations in the country. And again, I said one of the largest urban Indian populations. But when we began this inward look, looking at the failures on our part, we found that the data was really lacking. If you look at the pie chart, the top one is the gender of victims. And there was 24% of our victims where we didn't even identify gender info. It was just left blank when it came through from law enforcement agencies. The same thing with the race of victims, but even worse. We had 51% of our identified victims where we just had no idea the race info. And so what that means is that's information and data that we would share, right? That we would share to other agencies, to researchers, to schools, to grant writers, right? Without this data, there's no way that they can base funding requests on, or officers can, change the way they're policing in certain areas. There's just complete lack of data. And one thing that we also noted that was really concerning in that was that Seattle ranks #1 as having the highest rate of missing murdered Indigenous women and girls across the country. And the Times has done a lot of reports on it over the years. And so when we started doing this internal look, when we were seeing all of our failures, when we were seeing just how prevalent the issue is, we knew we had big issues, right? We knew we had to start somewhere. And we knew we needed to change what we were doing. And we didn't want to make the same mistakes that UIHI had identified in other reports. We wanted guidance, and we wanted guidance from the experts. But most importantly for me, I wanted guidance from the local Native voices dealing with this crisis firsthand. we can't operate in a bubble. We're members of a community, and we need to learn from those voices dealing with this crisis. And so we invited Abigail Echohawk and her team from the Urban Indian Health Institute down to our office. And for those of you that don't know or haven't heard about UIHI, the Urban Indian Health Institute is a public health authority in one of 12 tribal epidemiology centers in the country. And it's the only one that serves urban Indian health programs nationwide. UIHI conducts research, evaluation, collects and analyzes data, and provides disease surveillance to strengthen the health of American Indian and Alaska Native communities. So those are the experts we went to. And we went directly to Abigail. I had a connection with her, but she was the director of this UIHI. She is the expert. She's brought out these reports. If we're going to do this, we want to do this right. And we want to bring in the people that know what they're talking about. And when I talk about Abigail Echohawk, when I think about people like Stephanie Salazar, I always want to highlight when we see Native excellence, right? And Abigail Echohawk is an example of excellence. And so she came down, she brought her epidemiologists with her, she brought her program team members, and we opened up our system completely. We just said, this is what we have, have a look. What do you think we should do? Invited them to tell us what we should do to make changes. And that was probably early spring 2019. And we spent months working in the numbers, in the systems, continuing to meet with Abigail. And on the other side of that, while they're doing the numbers, Abigail and I started working the process of educating my leadership for the need for changes, historical issues, historical trauma, and why we needed to consult directly with the Muckleshoot tribe. Tribal sovereignty is of utmost importance to me, and I wanted to make sure that my bosses understood how important it is to operate on a sovereign to sovereign government approach, right? The highest level of our government needs to speak to the highest level of their government, right? Sovereignty is really key in working and developing partnerships. And it was really important that we take a holistic approach and follow the suggestions of UIHI, and because they're the experts in the room, really. And so this is going forward. We're educating our leadership, we're getting them on board. And by fall of 2020, COVID had broken out. So like we're doing here now, we're all working from home, but we didn't want to lose the momentum. And so we're starting the process for the tribal consultation back then. And it was important to engage leadership, to let them know what we're doing, right? The data that we collect is as much theirs as it is ours. If we're collecting data on their people, they should have access to that data. Data is so powerful. And we wanted to make sure that we were not hiding the ball. We want to build a relationship beyond data to serve our mutual communities. And we wanted to find a partner in combating this issue, right? And so through Abigail Echohawk, we set up this tribal consultation, and our entire leadership team had a summit with the tribal leaders at Muckleshoot Indian Tribe and the Urban Indian Health Institute. And we're hoping it's the first of many. We're working with them in a whole variety of different places now in our domestic violence teams, in our advocacy groups. It's been a really engaging process, one that we're really hoping will continue to strengthen that net for survivors of violence. But in this first meeting, we explained to them what we were doing, why we were doing it, asked for feedback, asked for input, wanted to indicate our goals that we wanted to partner. And so while everything is slowed by COVID, UIHI is currently in the process of their legal team drafting an MOU, a memo of understanding, for a three-way data sharing agreement with the tribe. And so that's one of the many things that we've done. We've done this consultation, we've started the data changes. We now have data changes that will allow us to identify not just whether someone is of multi-race, but what their tribal affiliation may be. Another thing that we wanted to do as we're developing these programs is we're going to need law enforcement buy-in. We're going to want them, because they're essentially where the data comes from, right? They're the folks having that one-on-one conversation with the victim of violence in the field. We want them to be able to provide that information, to collect that data and do it in a culturally appropriate way. And so we know we can't just start by ordering police to do things. Even though we're a huge agency, we're a huge prosecutor's office, we want buy-in from law enforcement. And so we've started as far back as 2019, doing certain things, working with our community to educate them. As a trial attorney, I'm always trying to convince people why. Not just why someone is guilty, but why they should care that someone is guilty of committing a crime. And so I always try to think of things in the why. Why should police officers care about collecting this data appropriately? And so one thing that we did is last year, we host every year a DV symposium. It's a state level, but nationally attended multi-day symposium. Police officers come, detectives, victim advocates, and other prosecutors from around the state and from other states. And we had some folks internationally this past year. But we sort of are organizers and sit on the organizing board of this. And so we did a focus on the interplay of tribal relations, tribal jurisdictions, and MMIWG. It was important for us to start that education process. So as soon as we can get that data collection backbone and framework in place, then law enforcement will be bought in, they'll understand the why, and we'll all be working together now. One of the things that we did in that symposium is we brought in guest speaker, Washington Supreme Court Justice Montoya Lewis. She's a New Mexico native. She's a Lobo as well, go Lobos. But she's the first enrolled member of any tribe to sit on a state Supreme Court in the US, and the second Native American to sit on a state Supreme Court. And she's currently on our Washington Supreme Court. And she came in and talked about her career in tribal courts as a tribal judge locally, and the impacts of gender-based violence, both in tribal courts, state courts, and how it interplays with missing and murdered Indigenous women and relatives. We also had Abigail Echohawk speak on her reports. We had Katrina May, a Dene and Laguna Pueblo woman, speak. She's a project manager at UIHI. Mary Catherine Nagel, who's a Cherokee lawyer with Pipestem Law. She's an activist in the MMIWR community. She came to speak. She's based out of Oklahoma and Washington, DC. And so we've had community organizations that provide direct support to victims of violence come to our office. We're trying to make connections with our advocates, with tribal community advocates, with victim service providers, with just community providers of mental health, substance abuse. Everyone come and just sort of build community, right? And that's hard to do in the COVID times, but it's important just to shake hands and get to know each other, right? Like that's how we develop safety nets for people, is we're making community connections. And so that's something that we really have focused on, is building community connections. But the last thing I want to talk about is our internal trainings. This summer, working with UIHI for the past couple of years now, we began training all of our employees for this data collection and implementation. Now that we've been able to get the software systems to agree to our changes to allow for tribal affiliation and multi-race identification of people, we wanted to train our entire office. We have approximately 200 prosecuting attorneys here and a huge staff. So we had UIHI come in and train all of our people, from leadership down to our receptionists, in the background of the missing and murdered Indigenous women crisis. To do our job right, we all need to know about the disproportionate violence against women and the impact to communities that MMIWG has, right? We've trained our people in a wide gamut of topics, including data collection, racial misclassification, but more importantly on the historical trauma, starting with failures and violence against Native peoples from the US government, from state governments, the rates of violence against Native women and girls. That's something I wanted everyone in our office to know, receptionists on down. And you may be asking yourself, why such a broad and intense training for our receptionists, right? And for me, to get people to want to make changes, like I said earlier, they have to know why it is important. And it's important because of the power we wield as prosecutors and the access we have to the data. And keeping that in mind, sorry, I skipped along. As prosecutors, we are keepers of the data. I was talking to one of Mr. Torres's folks earlier, and we were talking about how we're funnels, right? As prosecutor offices, we're funnels of data. We know that data is missing, but we also know where data comes from, right? We know where we can find other data. In the criminal system, as prosecutors, you have access to 911 calls for gender-based violence. We have incident reports. We have jail booking data. We have all sorts of places where we can get data from and keep, right? And so we need to be stepping up as prosecutors' offices because we have the means to do it. We have the responsibility to do it. We need to do a better job of keeping this data So folks like you in these task forces can come to us and get the data you need for funding. It's people that rely on data for funding requests, to write grants, to provide shelters, for crime intervention programs. They're unable to rely on the data right now because it's not accurate. So our goals are to get accurate data so that those resource allocation steps can be made in broad swaths so that people can get what they need to actually change the dynamics of our people, right? In addition to the criminal system, we have a civil system that we have access to. Temporary civil protection orders, permanent protection orders, and also there's a unique intersection of civil legal aid and family law and the criminal justice system. So those are things that we have. Data is often kept in little silos. What I see as prosecutors, we're funnels, right? I've said this before, but when we look at data, we can look at it, and I talked earlier about the micro level, but we're looking at it at a macro level right now, right? And this is just sort of how we draw out what these things are. Macro level, that's your policy stuff, your big remedies, your big fixes. Meso, that's what's going on in my county. Where can we send people resources locally? And then micro, that's that one-on-one interaction that people have, whether it's a social worker with a kid at school or a victim advocate with someone that's just been assaulted in a domestic violence situation, right? Those are the little things. So data can offer important opportunities to impact and make change on each one of those levels if it's done right. But if good data is going in, then good data is coming out. If bad data goes in, there's nothing we can do with it, right? And so here in King County, our response has been led by victims and families of missing and murdered and women and girls and Native peoples, and not by the criminal justice system. It was important for us to make those community connections first, get the buy-in and the okay, really, of the Muckleshoot Indian tribe to start collecting this data. We didn't want to collect those tribal affiliations until we got really approval because, like I said, this data is their data too. What else we are here? So the last thing I want to talk about is the toolkit. What we've learned at KCPAO is that as government agencies, as prosecutors and police officers and advocates, social workers, they can support this fight by engaging with Native community leaders, with public health officials, and with scientists like UIHI to determine appropriate law enforcement data collection protocols, address jurisdictional barriers to data sharing, and emphasize the necessity of substantive funding and legislative measures. And I've put on the screen here this UIHI toolkit. This is something that they're going to be rolling out sometime this summer so that any office across the country can have access to those training tools that they developed working with our office. The partnership has led to not just changes for us, but the development of a kit for them so that if you're in Duluth, Minnesota, you can do the same sort of changes that we did here in Seattle. I really hope that New Mexico looks at UIHI. I understand that there's a whole variety of different things that go on back home and do here, but it is a worthwhile check. And really that's just me pitching the UIHI toolkit because it's made such a huge change in the way our people really just assess just the simplest things as a phone call with someone who's trying to find their daughter, right? And for that, I'm forever thankful. I'm also thankful for you having me. I'm really honored to be here. I'm really excited for what New Mexico State Police is going to do. I'm really excited to see what Mr. Torres's team is going to be unrolling in Albuquerque. Albuquerque's home for me, so I'm really excited to see what's happening in New Mexico. I think New Mexico is in a really unique position to lead the way nationally to combat this crisis. And with the structure of the New Mexico State Patrol, with the LEA training academy there in Santa Fe, you really could make leaps and bounds if you decided to do something similar. Most importantly, thank you to Stephanie Salazar for inviting me here today and for always answering the phone to talk about these issues over the years. You've been amazing me for over a decade now with your commitment to people, to the community of New Mexico, and just to doing things right. So thank you guys again. I'm an open line call if you want to talk, get connected. I know I talk 1,000,000 miles an hour. I get really excited about this. So my apologies for rushing through. I'm happy to go over anything else with anyone if you want. I will stop this.
Thank you, Albany. Thank you so much. That was a really excellent presentation. And, you know, I can say I learned a lot in just the past 40 minutes, 50 minutes that you've been presenting. So I want to give our task force members an opportunity to ask questions. We have about 7 minutes, since we can take a couple questions if anyone has anything you want to ask about the data revamp in Seattle. You're welcome to raise your hand or just unmute yourself.
Hi, this is Maddie. So my question all the time is going to be including like trans populations. So I think with the data presentation that you did is phenomenal. And I was wondering if like trans populations were part of the data or will be in the future. Reason being that the trans women population who identify as women also too. So categorizing and identifying, is that part of the data collection, or is that would that be something to look into?
So I can tell you right now that we've been focusing on trans rights in Seattle for a very long time. Our office allows, I guess allows isn't the right term, but if someone identifies as a gender, then that's the gender we're going to put in our system, right? We're not going to force anyone to put something that may be on a DOL that they haven't had the ability to change it. So if the concern is directly related to trans specific and specifically identified as trans, I'll have to look into how we're doing that. If we have a separate, I know we have an O option for male, female O, but really we're not going to label someone for someone. We're going to let them tell us how to classify them. That's sort of what our goal is here, is to honor people and how they identify. But if that's something you think I should look into, I'd love to get your contact and go into that, because I do understand that we have a lot of trans attacks here in our city, not just on Native trans people, but it's a countrywide problem. And if there's something that we should be looking at, I would love to talk to anyone to get the information that you think I should have to make changes in that realm as well.
Yeah, I think with data collection, like asking like 2-part questions or asking certain questions with data collection is great. And how one identifies is perfect, because sometimes we miss numbers. Like for me, if I were to identify as a Native woman because my driver's license says female and not as a trans woman, then that would miss me being identified as a trans woman.
Okay.
So I would be categorized. So I think even just that could be a challenge too, because of our documentations when we align our gender with the documentations that we want rather than what was given to us. And doing that, and that could be part of that data collection. I know there's great organizations in Seattle area who are doing a great job with the trans community, and looking at a lot of stuff and welcoming like Native populations. And I believe there are some Native trans women who have been part of like some of the organizations there. I think Utopia is very open to working with our Native trans populations also.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Maddie. I also see that Delegate Karate has her hand up. So, morning, Delegate Karate.
Oh yeah, so Ms. Burns, Shekia Ani Neshla do Bilagana Bashichin, Destiny the Shachedo, Bilagana the Chanela, Shay Amber Kinas Bakrati, Tohatsoy the Nutshell. So that's how I represent myself and my family as a Navajo woman. I'm on the Navajo Nation Council, so we're elected leaders. I wanted to ask how you're working with local tribal leadership in the Data Institute. The work is fantastic from the Urban Indian Health Institute. Now, I know sometimes it's hard, then how does that translate into the tribal communities that you serve or tribal territories? And also we have a missing and murdered Dene relatives. That's an all volunteer group here on the Navajo Nation. So how then do you work with like tribal entities and then let's say community-based entities? Because our focus is really on families and survivors, and the Navajo Nation at this point hasn't really created that space for the families and survivors to be part of the conversation. So if you could help me understand how you pull in that perspective when you're dealing with the data initiative. We do have some family members who do not trust the system. And so even though we encourage them to maybe put them in NamUs, they just have had a really bad experience. And so we're also looking at really focusing on their stories. So if you could just help me understand that conversation. And lastly, the financial aspect. So we know it's really until very recently that any of this type of activities were funded at a federal level. So if you could maybe shed light on how you're funding the data initiative. We have had some few conversations like with the Bureau of Justice, and we've had conversations with like ANA and other federal partners, but we haven't been successful at this point to get federal funding for a data institute. So thank you, I appreciate the presentation.
Okay, let me see if I can answer these. I'll do the funding part up front. We haven't gotten any outside funding for this. This is something that our elected has taken very seriously. It's alarming, it's a nationwide problem. The work that we're doing internally with the help of UIHI is going to have bigger effect on all of our data collection, right? By going to scientists and talking to them about how to collect this data and working with them, which they've done as just a partnership with us. They've never asked for a penny. They just have been wanting to share to make a difference in their community. We haven't gotten any extra funding for this, but we're hoping that by prioritizing this, because it should be prioritized, right? Like we have a duty to our community as prosecutors to make this a priority. We need to know who we're serving. We need to know who we're deciding things like where to prosecute, where to send police, things like that. Like we have a duty. So my boss made it a priority to fund this internally. The systems that we have is this huge software system that they invested in several years back that we really haven't even grasped its full capabilities yet. And they bought that system in the hopes that we could start doing this analysis, right? We have a lot of very discrete demographic discrete demographic communities, such as sub-Saharan African communities that are experiencing violence different than our other African-American communities. We have Ethiopian systems. We have a really large Pacific Islander community, as well as an Asian community that is experiencing a lot of hate crime right now, but that is not getting, the data isn't desegregated, so to speak. The data isn't broken out. And so that's something we're trying to do, not just in our Native populations, but in these other populations as well. And that's something that we've just, taken on as our role as prosecutors and our commitment to the community. So we haven't gotten outside funding for that. So I don't have any good resources for you to go there. As far as working with the tribal governments, it was important to us before we started rolling out the changes that we meet with the tribal community that shares a border with us, because the people that live within the Muckleshoot Nation, because it's a 280 institute is also ours. I have a delivery coming up, so my dog may bark. I apologize in advance because he loses his mind. But so we met with the tribal leaders, right? Leadership to leadership. It's important to honor tribal sovereignty, and it's important to recognize that you can't just send me. I'm just a low-level attorney, right? Like, it's important that we recognize the sovereign nations and the power that they play in their communities, right? And have that government to government relationship. And that's something we've trained our folks on. Like, you can't just drive over and talk to somebody, right? Like, these are governments. It would be like going to Canada and trying to tell them what to do, right? These are full governments, and educating our people on that has been really fun, because it's interesting to see the wheels work. I went to UNM School of Law, jurisdiction, tribal law. That's something we almost all take there. But seeing it interplay outside of New Mexico is much different. When I was a police officer, we would call the governor and ask permission to go on the property of the nation. To go onto the nation, to enter the pueblo, we had to get permission. And that's not something that exists here, right? Because it's PL 280, the Muckleshoot tribe is policed by King County Sheriff's officers that are delegated to the tribal law enforcement. And so it's really startling to me to see how different it is. I prefer the New Mexico method personally because it honors sovereignty and honors tribal nations in a way I think that's way more appropriate. But whenever we go to talk about communities and family members, moving on to your second question, that's something that we've been trying to work on through our community outreach programming. We have a whole team of victim advocates. We've been working with the Seattle Indian Health Board, which is the overarching community group that UIHI is a part of. They have DV advocates, they have sexual assault advocates. We've been working with them. They're revamping their, I don't know if you guys know what a SANE nurse is, but it's the sexual assault nurse examiner. You talked about having a mistrust of the system and a mistrust of police. And we all know why that mistrust exists, right? There's been hundreds of years of the US government failing and victimizing tribal peoples and tribal nations. And so it makes complete sense as to why victims of crime would have that distrust in the system. And so we're trying to think of ways to work together as partners to get over that. UIHI has now developed a SANE nurse program to inform victims of sexual violence what to expect if they do a SANE exam. They've brought in SANE nurses from Harborview, and I think they'll soon be able to do SANE exams there in Seattle, where it's Native nurses speaking with Native victims, having these conversations in safe places and describing what they're going to go through in a place that's safe and that allows for them to feel comfortable and like they're not going to be mistreated by the government, right? And where they'll be heard. And I think that's always been a problem, at least here, where people don't feel heard. And we have a great sexual assault resource center in King County, amazing women. They've been working on building that connection. We've been working with Mother Nation, which is a DV outreach group. We're a member, the King County Prosecuting Attorney's Office has been invited to join the Cedar Rising Coalition. It's a coalition led by Native women who work with mental health, with substance abuse, with gender-based violence, with missing women. And so it's almost like this, I want to say, underground community where if someone goes missing in Auburn, where the Muckleshoot is, I'll get an email with a poster. We'll send it out to police. There's a woman that's a tribal liaison with the Washington State Patrol. She'll send it to the west side. She'll send it to the east side. And so we're trying to get what you have in New Mexico, which is a task force going, and that'll start hopefully this fall. They've allocated funds for that. But until that happens, we're just sort of trying to build connections and build communities together to have a safe place. One thing that I've really been trying to push and find money for, this is going to your money question, is a navigator. One thing that we've done when we started looking at things and when we look at crime in King County is we look at it almost as a public health situation, right? As a systems based in public health. And one thing that public health institutions have are navigators. We have navigators in our office that focus with children navigating the criminal justice system and victims navigating the criminal justice system. Aside from advocates, navigators will help you know who to contact to get a shelter, who to contact to get mental health, who to contact at the prosecutor's office to get an advocate. I'm really trying to find money right now, and we're not at this point yet, but I think that we need, at least in Western Washington, a navigator for families of missing women and girls and relatives. A navigator that they could go to who will have all these answers, who will be able to be a one-stop shop for this is the police you need to talk to. This is a hospital that may know. This is the Mother Nation DV shelter, DV folks. This is where Chief Seattle Club is located. Your sister may be staying there. I can call there. But right now it's just, if you happen to know, right? And happen to know who might be searching. They have one amazing woman that leads searches of the city for missing folks. I would love to find resources to give her a navigator to help her just a one-stop shop for families, because we get calls from, Montana. People were trying to get from Billings back to Seattle, or from Seattle to their family at Rocky Boy, where we have these systems in place. And if we had one person, one navigator that we could fund as a position full-time, I think it would make a huge difference. I'm a big believer in the public health system of navigators, and I'm hoping that we can find funding for that. I hope I answered your questions. I know I ramble, I'm so sorry.
Thanks, Albany. All right, so we have 3 more hands up, and we also need to move on to our next presentation. So if just keep it brief and we can move on, but I'll turn it over to Chastity now.
I am Chastity Sandoval. I am also from the Navajo Nation, but I work for Nambe Pueblo. One thing that I am working on here with the Nambe Pueblo is to revise and modify our codes, our tribal community criminal codes. And one thing I kind of want to establish overall in the Native tribal communities here in New Mexico is a toolkit. And I know that Sovereign Bodies Institute does have a format for that, but how do we start this? I know that I had spoken to some tribal advocates as well as tribal courts, because right now with the data subcommittee group, I am working on figuring out what do they have in their codes that addresses human trafficking, the protocols for when a person goes missing. And I think that is very important. If you don't have it in the codes, it's, that makes it really hard to address these issues in tribal communities. And being a tribal legal advocate for Nambe, I have represented a lot of clients, relatives that we call them, and a lot of the things fall through the cracks because they don't have it in the codes. So that was one thing I decided to work on, is how to do that. So I submitted that. I have the final draft out, and I have my deadline is by November to present this to tribal leadership and council and to get it approved. I guess one thing, my question with that is also what do we see in tribal codes that can help with this, with protecting the victims of human trafficking, and what protocols that are usually common that the community can use? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I love when people are wanting to look at codes and regulations and statutes. I know that based in the basement at UNM School of Law is American Indian Law Center, and they've done a lot of work with tribal codes. But Ms. Salazar may have ideas for you about who to talk to locally. It's been 10 years since I've been in New Mexico working directly with folks like Helen Padilla, working on those codes and things. But this may be something that might be a fun thing to get law students on board with, right? Because they're digging and reading codes, developing codes. You have an amazing local law school there at UNM and a Southwest Indian Law Clinic. That might be something that they're interested in. I don't know their bandwidth right now. I know that Barbara Creel, who is my personal mentor and good friend, is running that program, as well as Sam Winder. They may have some access to resources about the code drafting specifically to help get some help and some guidance there. I know it's something that they've both done in the past. But I would turn this question over to Stephanie, because I don't have the details that would be more helpful to you right now currently, just because I've been away from home for so long.
That's fine, thank you.
But it's exciting work. That's so exciting.
Thank you, Chastity. And we can circle back on that. I'll give some announcements later today, but we do have a partnership with Silk this semester, and that perhaps is something they can start looking into. All right, 2 more questions here. I'll go to Shelley Begay.
Oh, hi, thank you, Stephanie. Hi, Ms. Burns. My name is Shelley Begay. I'm the Native American Liaison for the Office of the Secretary for Human Services Department. I definitely had a question regarding your information and the jurisdiction gaps. I know you're working out of Seattle. You've talked a lot about your tribal consultation, your process, and your networking with the tribal agencies. I'm just wondering, what is the involvement from the feds? And not only the engagement level, but also their involvement in processing and then also sharing data between the three agencies.
So right now we don't have a MOU in place with the feds. They have recently hired a man who is running their Washington District MMIW response team. I've been in contact with him. I will say things are, I'm trying to think of a delicate way to put this, things are different now post January 2020 in our ability to work with the federal system a little bit more. We have previously worked well with their domestic violence advocates. They'd worked in our office, so we have some access and sharing of resources. But again, it's all really who you know, community conversations. Like I'll call Shelley up and she'll be able to put me in contact with someone whenever I'm like, well, I think this might be a Major Crimes Act type crime because it occurred within the boundaries of the reservation. We need to get an FBI agent out here. We don't have anything official in place right now as far as that response goes. They've just recently put someone in charge of that MMIW response. I'm really excited and hopeful to see what Cabinet Secretary Holland does. I think it's going to be, huge across the country, and I'm hopeful that these little systems that we have in Washington and the task force that you have in New Mexico, that they can start making hands meet and handshakes and community change and bigger data movement. I'm hoping that as we get started in Washington with our task force, that we're going to be able to make these data changes across the board in all of Washington. And I'm hoping that if we do that in Washington, if New Mexico does something similar, something different and better, that the feds will get on board and start following. I'm trying to be careful with my words here when talking about dealing with the federal government, but it can be, it's different here in Washington than New Mexico. I knew BIA members, and I know Brenda was on this team, and it's different back home. And I think that's one of the reasons I think I'm so excited to see what happens in New Mexico, because you're in a really unique position to lead the way nationally and get the federal government on board that we may not be able to. We don't have the connections that I'd like to see yet, and we're still working on that. That's kind of a sad, worthless answer, but it's the best I got.
Thanks, Albany. Thanks for the question, Shelley. And our last question here is Michelle Curtis.
Yate, everyone. Ahiahe Albany for your presentation. My name is Michelle Curtis. I'm with the Coalition of Stop Violence Against Native Women. I am the Sex Trafficking Project Coordinator. I was formerly a direct service provider. I worked as a lead case manager for a human trafficking program. And I love the fact that you mentioned having advocates for MMIW families, looking for their missing relatives. And I know in Albuquerque, we're surrounded by many tribal communities, but I know organizations, they have HIPAA policies. So how would you implement, advocates helping families locate missing relatives in urban areas without breaching HIPAA policies and confidentiality?
So you have to be really careful and follow the law with that. I think we're all aware, if you've had direct service positions where you're providing direct services to people, sometimes people don't want to be found for a lot of good reasons, right? They may have gone missing. And I think one thing that we just had a meeting on at our Cedar Rising meeting is we don't want to be in a position where we're helping an abuser find their victim, right? Where we have to, you know, I don't know what the right words are. We have to be very careful about, like you said, HIPAA. If you're doing direct services providing, you need to follow HIPAA rules, right? If you have a navigator for families, that navigator doesn't necessarily have to say, we saw Michelle 3 weeks ago, she was at Chief Seattle, she was getting services there. They can say there is a location where when people come into the city and they're unhoused, this is where she could be. She may be at another shelter. Here are some resources for you as a family member to talk to. This is what the federal government is doing these searching. This is how you get a name into NamUs. I know that some of you guys have covered NamUs stuff, but there's really only police or a direct family member can put that name in. So I think one thing that we were talking about in our last meeting was, while we know that people are trying to avoid police for a variety of reasons, sometimes without having that police report, we really can't share any information because we are, you know, kept by law from sharing information. So I think having a navigator to just show the systems, who can do searches, who can talk to it, but still keeping that HIPAA protections in place is really important. And then I think that's why it's so important to work as community groups together, right? Because you, Michelle Curtis, as a direct service provider previously, you might not be able to give that information out, but someone else in the community may be able to, right? Not give out the details, but give out the tips and the tricks to navigating the system on the streets of Seattle or the community along the coast, whatever it may be. I think a navigator would be good about that, but that's a very good question because we do have to keep those victims and their personal information protected. So I you know, you always have to follow the laws there, but it's a tough one, but that's something that we talk about too here.
Great. Thank you so much, Albany, for your time this morning. One of the first things you said was, you know, speaking about Debbie, you know, all you knew about her was within the data system. I think that was very striking to me, and it speaks to the importance of better data collection. And so along those same lines, we have our district attorney, Raul Torres here. I was going to read the bio, but my computer just turned off. And so I think what I'll do, Raul, is I'll just put it in the chat if you don't mind.
Yeah, you can skip the bio, it's fine. I think my mom might've wrote it anyway, so it's okay.
Well, it's a lovely bio and I'll put it in the chat, thank you.
Yeah. So the first thing I wanna do, Stephanie, is thank you. And I also wanna compliment Albany. I think she's just tremendous. I'm good friends with DA Satterberg out in King County, and I can't promise Albany that I'm not going to try and maybe recruit you if you want to think about coming home. I also want to just take a moment to thank the task force for allowing us an opportunity to present some of the things that tools and resources that we think can aid in the work of this important group. But I also want to start by acknowledging that we're very late to the conversation. And so I will beg your forgiveness at the outset that if we cover anything with regard to either data, law enforcement, or anything else, that the task force is already well on its way to finding and identifying solutions. Please feel free to disregard anything that we have to offer. But we do have some ideas about things that we've developed inside the district attorney's office that I think may be of use. And this really got started with a conversation that Regis Pecos and I had many months ago about the work that we have and the capabilities that we've basically developed inside the DA's office, and we're still developing. We thought it would be an opportune moment to meet with everyone. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and hopefully can everyone see the presentation? Great. And the other thing I'd like to do, I know we're kind of over on time, so I want to just ask anyone if questions arise during the course of the presentation, feel free to just raise your hand, and I'll leave it to Stephanie to sort of go through those questions as we go, because I've found that a lot of times it's more helpful for people to ask their questions in context, and then maybe we can really pinpoint some of those things. So what we are basically here to talk about is how the Crime Strategies Unit, which is a new unit, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about its history, can support the work of law enforcement and the work of all of our partners, tribal, state, local, and federal partners, in developing real-time actionable intelligence so that we can actually take immediate law enforcement action. And so there is as you know, we'll talk about a little bit further into the presentation, there are obviously very serious data issues around understanding the scale and scope of the problem, and Albany did a very good job about sort of highlighting those. But I want to sort of separate out a couple of things from a data perspective. The first is, what is the long-term scope and scale of the problem that policymakers are going to need to make appropriations and new investments, restructure organizations and institutions, and really give the legislature, tribal leaders, the governor, and other federal officials a broad view of the size and scale of the problem. That's a little bit different than the sort of tactical level intelligence that the Crime Strategies Unit specializes in. And so I want to make that distinction at the outset, because what we're really all about is trying to identify cases where we can take affirmative steps to locate and help missing Indigenous women in real time, or identify suspects who are potentially connected to the murder of Indigenous women and relatives in real time. So there's that difference between sort of strategic level data that is informing policy and tactical level data that we specialize in terms of supporting law enforcement. So what does it mean for us? And in order to really understand it, you have to go back a few years. When I came into the district attorney's office, many people here will remember that the office had become overwhelmed with old files. We had existing pending files. We had dead files that were sitting and lining the hallways. And one of the first things that there was an impulse on in my leadership team was, we should take all of this stuff and get it out and toss it, right? We should get rid of this information of all of these old boxes, because what's the value in it? What's the use of it? One of the critical insights that we had right off the bat is that a lot of very useful information and specific data was trapped inside these boxes. Information about potential suspects, cars, firearms, known associates, were sitting in paper folders and in paper format, and they were effectively locked for investigators and prosecutors. So they weren't in a position where we could actually make use of them. So we didn't throw out the trash. Instead, we took all of this information off site. We took it to the Bernalillo County District Attorney's Office or Bernalillo County Clerk's Office, digitized everything, scanned everything in, and created a format so that we could actually query the information. And what that did is just really whet the appetite of the leadership team in the office for gaining access to new information, and more importantly, the fresh information that was coming right out of police reports in our partner agencies, specifically with the Albuquerque Police Department. So what we started to do then is to make a really concerted effort to identify and understand what were the sources of big data and how law enforcement could make use of it. And what we really started to find out, as Albany mentioned, is that most law enforcement data sits in siloed systems. Within an agency, for example, the Albuquerque Police Department, there are multiple systems that can't communicate with one another. And then across agencies, there are multiple systems that can't communicate with one another. And what we discovered is this notion that if we were able to access all of these points, all of this data, and integrate it into a meaningful picture, what we could start to do is organize and present a real life understanding of what was really happening on the ground. And so this illustration is simply that, this notion of having access to lots of different points, but no clear picture of what you're looking at until it's organized and oriented in the right way. So this is fundamentally what the Crime Strategies Unit does. But before we could engage in that work, we actually had to build the unit. And inside the DA's office, was the largest footprint on the first floor of the building, and it was filled with all of these 20 and 30-year-old case files. We emptied it out after going up to Santa Fe and getting some new appropriations. And in its place, we have this modern, pretty sophisticated investigative and analytical unit that helps right now to support law enforcement to do a couple of things. First, we do some of the only forensic genealogy investigations in the state. So we're actively engaged in solving cold case sexual assault cases, but also cold case homicides. There's about a dozen of those pending right now. But we also integrate across multiple platforms information about who is engaged in violent crime in the greater Bernalillo County area, and then work with those partner agencies to figure out patterns of conduct so that we can really get ahead of the violence problem here in Albuquerque. It has taken years and years and years of fights about appropriations and investments in technology and getting people to understand what we're trying to do. But really what we need to do is engage in strategic analysis. And so what we're doing inside the DA's office right now is primarily focused on reducing gun violence by identifying those key groups and crime drivers who are engaged in an overwhelming share of crime. And if you look at the rest of the country, about 60 to 70% of gun crime is committed by 0.5% of a total population, which means it's a highly specialized type of criminal activity, even amongst criminals, and it's a group-based activity. And what we then do is we combine police data, open source police reports and incident reports that we have from active investigations and social media analysis to create a structured view of what's going on in the system. And so what we're hoping to deliver is this: it's actionable intelligence, and it's taken years of investments and partnerships with New Mexico Tech and Sandia National Labs and others to take all of this unstructured data and put it into one comprehensive platform that we can actually parse out so that we can understand what's going on inside the community. One of the things that we specialize in is called network analysis. Network analysis actually at a large scale enables a computer program to go through. In this instance, if you look at this graph on the left, this is network analysis for the Game of Thrones, right? That's for those of you who are Game of Thrones fans, you'll recognize those groups and the leaders of those groups. And what's interesting about this graphic is not that it's displayed in this way, it's that this display was actually generated by a computer program that was able to go through and look at the connections that are in the story of Game of Thrones, parse out every group, and then identify the leaders of those groups so that we can really figure out who the crime drivers are. So we take that information, and what we're trying to do right now, and this is very much conceptual, but it's being built and developed right now, is to try and identify the top and most impactful violent crime groups currently operating in the city of Albuquerque, who are the primary drivers and leaders and organizers of those groups, and then deliver that information in real time to our law enforcement partners. So this is just a visual display of the kind of work that we're doing right now. What you see here on the left, this is actually the first ever rendering of actual police data. This is police data taken from a couple of years ago from the Albuquerque Police Department, where we could ingest all this information through police reports. And what you are basically seeing is, if you see all these tiny one-off dots, those are individual offenders inside the criminal justice system and the data that's associated with them. That's one act. But that's not really what we're focused on. What we're more interested in than anything else are these clusters. Those are active criminal networks that are operating in the system. And what we found is that our law enforcement partners The robbery unit may be working on an individual case, and the narcotics unit may be working on an individual case, and the homicide unit may be working on a separate case, and they're all actually working on the same group, but they don't know it because they don't actually organize the data in such a way that they can see a real life picture. So this on the right is basically a strand of an actual organized crime group here in the city. And this is a test case scenario that our programmers have used to develop and identify whether or not they're actually able to pull out and find specific groups and then those organizers within the data universe. And so it turns out that, yes, this is in fact something that is doable. It's complex. It takes a lot of complex technology, but also an investment in human beings. And I can't stress enough for you as you get into this work about data collection and organization and aggregation and how do you develop it and deploy it in real time, especially across multiple jurisdictions. You can't underestimate how important it is to invest in the people power and the types of skilled individuals that you need to run a system like this. So all of this is sort of a preface to a specific finding that I noticed in the MMIWR final report that you put out in December. And what this is effectively talking about is the fact that there are significant discrepancies in reported data. This is talking about the discrepancies between the national database, the state missing persons information clearinghouse, which is also different from the city of Albuquerque's clearinghouse and Bernalillo County level data and its clearinghouse. And what it tells me is that you are encountering much of the same structural and technical problems that we encountered when we first started building this system several years ago. But it also tells me that the techniques and some of the groundwork that we've invested in terms of building this platform might be, if it's something that is useful to the task force or useful to the stakeholders, we might be well positioned to support those efforts. But obviously there's going to be some substantial challenges in going about it. This is just a screenshot. I'm sure most of the members of the task force are familiar with this. This is a screenshot of the database that you can query at the national level. And you can go in here and filter by state, by the various just demographic descriptors. And what you end up with is if you run this query at that national level, you can see the filters that we use. We ran it this morning. It was filter for female, filter for ethnicity. We put in American Indian, and then filter for state, and it says New Mexico. And what pops out is that there's 21 missing persons that match those filters. I am no expert in this space, and as everyone here knows, we're relatively late to this conversation, but I don't think anyone actually believes that there's only 21 missing Indigenous women in the state. So clearly there's a data issue, and I know that there are data subcommittees that are working on this, and they are working on developing platforms and programs to try and bring all of this information together so that policymakers have a clear idea. From a tactical level, what this tells me is that for frontline investigators, before you establish a cold case unit or a unit that gets engaged in trying to figure out where these women are and whether or not a crime has been committed, you must first start with a very clear assessment of what your data picture looks like. And right now it seems to be very highly fractured because of various technical deficiencies, because we don't have access, we don't have uniform training, we don't have uniform inputs. And there may be a police report that gets filed in a tribal law enforcement agency, and then a contact that is made by, for example, the Albuquerque Police Department, but there's right now no ability to instantly match the missing persons report from that tribal law enforcement agency and the urban, police department. And so one of the things that we would offer assistance in is building this technical platform into what is currently under development with our business partners here in Albuquerque. And then what we can then do is figure out a way to integrate the information and then deliver the information in real time. This is a very simplified snapshot of work that's already underway. We secured a $3 million grant from the Department of Justice several years ago. We've been working with New Mexico Tech. We are already integrating and working with them to support the integration of multiple public safety databases there. And then once that integration is complete, we will then pipe that data back to the district attorney's office so that we can layer it into the Bernalillo County Sheriff's Office, the Albuquerque Police Department, so that we have a better understanding about what's happening in Torrance County, Valencia County, Sandoval County, that will aid our investigators. But it's also a window into the type of work that I think we could do to solve some of these issues. The point of convergence is that in about 3 or 4 months ago, because of all of this development work, we received a $3 million grant from a coalition of business leaders here in Albuquerque who are fully invested in this type of work. We'll be developing something that on the back end looks like this. And this gives you an orientation to how we ingest all the information and data across multiple platforms. We then clean the information, and then we develop applications for police, for prosecutors, and for our analysts to then take it into their frontline work to see if there are patterns of conduct, organized crime groups that we are not aware of that are operating in plain sight, but the data points are not being matched up properly. Again, all of the investment now is geared towards giving police commanders and detectives and folks that are operating in Bernalillo County a window into gun crime, but it could very easily be reoriented to include an application in this system that would focus on MMIW. And this is a rendering of one of the tools that our analysts will be able to use so that you can filter it by location, you can filter it by proximity and time, you can filter it by various parameters. There really is no limitation on how we can organize the data. But again, the most important thing is not long-term historical data to assist policymakers. It's short-term actionable intelligence that we can deliver to police, prosecutors, and analysts, hopefully to intervene and take specific action. One other important element of the proposal that we have with the Business Coalition is that we didn't want to just build this system without including the next generation. And so Cultivating Coders has worked to develop a program in support of this initiative. And what it will effectively do is recruit young people from the community. Right now, again, focused on gun violence, but could very easily be focused on to include MMIW. We would bring people in from various communities. A lot of times we have people that are really talented, but they don't have access to apprenticeships. They don't have access to the kind of technical support and training that they would need. And the idea is to bring a whole cohort of young people into the building, into the DA's office, teach them coding skills, sit them down with some really incredible and talented people from Sandia and RS21, which is our technical partner on this project. And so that we can start building real world skills to help communities actually think about the cutting edge in technology and what we can do in terms of applying big data to solving some of these big problems. So again, our focus at the outset would be to dedicate at least an analyst in support of first collecting, analyzing, and sharing data and intelligence with tribes and statewide partners. We would obviously start, as Avani mentioned, with tribal consultation and government to government consultation about how we can come up with a system that streamlines systems analysis, data collection, data sharing, and then integrating all of those metrics into what is probably the most difficult thing to do. The technical side is often very difficult, but the data sharing agreements are oftentimes as complex and as challenging. We have a lot of experience in navigating those relationships, and I think that would be beneficial to the task force. And then once that heads-up display, that real-time view of what's happening on the ground here in New Mexico is in place, we would then organize a cold case unit focused on Bernalillo County, because my jurisdictional limits confine me at this point to crimes that have a nexus to this jurisdiction. But what we can also do is then, for those active crimes and investigations that are open, we can disseminate real-time intelligence to law enforcement partners at every level: tribal law enforcement, federal law enforcement, and state law enforcement. So that is, in a nutshell, a very quick overview of the kinds of things that we can bring to the table in terms of the crime strategies unit. And I think with that, I will stop and see what questions I can ask or answer. And I will tell you at the outset that if there were highly technical questions, I will probably defer to my chief of policy and planning, who understands the underlying architecture of our data sharing and crime strategy unit better than anyone.
Thank you, District Attorney Torres. Task force members, any questions at this time? That was a lot of information, and I saw some comments in the chat that, wow, it's just, yeah, it's a lot of information. So if folks want to jump in and ask questions, please raise your hand. Delegate Karate.
Yes, thank you for the presentation. I appreciate the insight and looking at how you're building up your data. So understanding your jurisdiction is within Bernalillo County, how do you plan to address, and there's always a challenge, like when the crime occurs outside of your jurisdiction, but then maybe evidence or activities happened in your jurisdiction. So how do you work? I know if you're talking about gun violence or DUIs, DWIs, there's these partnerships. Do you foresee partnerships when we talk about missing persons? Mm-hmm. And then the second question is in terms of, and looking at NamUs, I do want to recommend that Miski Yabetse, who's on the task force for Navajo relatives, is really our expert when it comes down to looking at the data, understanding, because NamUs until very recently, right, 2018, started identifying individuals, but her and her team have also identified others, like beyond the cold cases, or if there's like Jane Does or John Does that need to be identified. So that might be something that's helpful. And the last thing is, so when I talked about that jurisdiction, federal, you do have tribal nations and within tribal territories. So then how do you work with the federal partners, and what would we see in your data? Like, would we then have to just rely on our federal partners, or would we see that also in your data? Like, how are you what's the distinction that we should see, or the recommendation on how you could build that up, since you're developing this data base? And I understand it's just like a short-term snapshot, but for the work that we're doing, especially when it comes to like sex trafficking or in violence, some of the crimes originate in Bernalillo County, and then they're missing in tribal communities. So it's kind of either way. So if you could help me understand that. But I appreciate the support and the energy, and I hope we get to the point. Well, first we have to work on 911, but hopefully we could get to the point where we could map out something like that here on Navajo. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. And so the first thing that I will tell you is there's an asymmetry on the enforcement side. And what I mean by an asymmetry is this: crimes and in particular organized crimes, rather than a one-off crime. And organized crime benefits from the fact that it moves fluidly and it moves seamlessly from the original point of origin that may have occurred squarely on tribal land. And then there is an intersection with state jurisdiction that is proximate to tribal land, and then continues across 2 or 3 different counties into Albuquerque, and then maybe across the state, right? So they don't, when they're engaged in that kind of organized criminal activity, they give no thought whatsoever, because they're engaged in this crime, and crossing these boundaries don't have any meaning for them. But for those of us in the enforcement side, that's often the point at which things fall apart, because maybe there is a missing persons report in Albuquerque, and then maybe there's a traffic stop in Farmington, and then maybe there's an FBI contact in Denver. And right now, what I can tell you, based on just my experience in Bernalillo County, forget jurisdiction. I have systems where the Bernalillo County Sheriff's Office and their data does not meet or match the Albuquerque Police Department. So what we are doing effectively is to try and take both the technical side of navigating the systems, because maybe Bernalillo County Sheriff's Office has a system that was built in 1992 and APD's was built in 1998. And even if they wanted to communicate, they couldn't communicate. So that's the first thing, is the technical side. Those things are compounded by the challenges that we see in Indian country, because a lot of times there are no systems. There may not be any built infrastructure at all. And then if there is the built infrastructure, is it organized in such a way that we can make positive matches across those arbitrary jurisdictional lines? So there's the technical side of it, but then there's also the jurisdictional side of it, because we would have to navigate agreements, for example, with the FBI. I'm a former assistant U.S. attorney, and I used to do that work a lot. I work closely with Kyle Nabeck. I've known him for years. He runs the Indian Crimes section in the U.S. Attorney's Office. And we would start with a meeting with me, Kyle, BIA, FBI, put everybody in a room, and we would start mapping those things out just with our federal partners. But then we also have to go and meet and consult with every single distinct tribal community and their government structures, and map out what information will be shared, and then once you map that piece of it out, what investments are missing, right? So you have to be able to engage in both the technical side and the intergovernmental negotiation of sharing of information. The ultimate goal is that I am as fluid and as seamless as my adversary, right? We want to get law enforcement to the point where we are as flexible and as adaptable as those that we are trying to deal with. And that's the asymmetry challenge. And my sense is that you're going to have to build this slowly, probably predicated on which governmental organizations are willing to have the conversation, which governmental organizations have the invested infrastructure, and then you build it one piece at a time. In other words, rather than waiting for a partnership and an arrangement to be established with all my partner agencies before I did anything, we made a very important strategic decision right up front, which was, we're going to go partner with whoever we can partner with right now. We're going to demonstrate some success, and then we'll use that success to talk to the next partner and the next partner and the next partner. So from a strategic standpoint, one of the things that I would tell you just from my own experience trying to do this just inside Bernalillo County is for the task force to meet people where they are at whatever level of development and readiness that they have, and to let it build organically based on the extent to which we can hammer out those agreements, but also identify the infrastructure challenges. But it's, to your point, you hit it right on the head, because there may be evidence of the origin point of a crime that may be out in Indian Country in San Miguel County. And if the Albuquerque Police Department doesn't even know that they're encountering somebody that may be connected to that crime, they have no way of reaching back to the tribal law enforcement agency and say, hey, hang on to that piece of evidence, hang on to that phone number. What about that license plate? All of those things get lost. And the ultimate goal is not, frankly, for the DA's office to build a cold case unit, which we are happy to help do. It's to try and build a world where these cases don't get cold, right? Cold cases are notoriously difficult for law enforcement to solve. And the answer is to never let them get cold in the first place. And that means allowing law enforcement to communicate in real time. That's the challenge, but I think it's a place where we're well suited to take on the challenge. What other questions can I answer?
Go ahead, Maddie.
This is Maddie. So I love the presentation on your sophisticated data analysis, graph and chart and stuff. But one thing that came to mind is when you were showing some of the forms and stuff, I took a quick glance in categorization other than male and female of unsure or other. In the future, will those change, especially like with trans populations or LGBT communities? Because sometimes violence and murder is motivated by hate, and sometimes sexual orientation could be part of that and stuff. So is that like something that collected data-wise or looked at in certain ways, and in the future could possibly be a subcategory or looking at some of the data separation?
So that's an excellent point. I think the snapshot that you're referring to is the current fields that are available at the National Clearinghouse. So yeah. That's what we showed you. What I would tell you is we have the ability, since we're building it, to design it in any way that real leaders in this space can help us identify, right? So we would ask folks like Albany, we would ask folks in the community, we would ask folks to give us, how detailed do you want to be able to look? Because in my own world, right, I want to be able to look at gun crimes in this zip code connected to this person. So I'm constantly adding to that tool new parameters that are constantly evolving. What I would do in this instance is not presume to know what the categories are. What I can tell you is that we have the technical capability to design it from the ground up to meet whatever parameters are useful to practitioners in this area. And that's the advantage of coming into a situation where we're actively building the system. We can build it in such a way that it, frankly, not just sets a standard for the state. I'm pretty sure that the kinds of capabilities we're trying to bring to this haven't been done anywhere, probably in the country, in terms of matching the technical integration with the legal framework. So we have the ability to kind of design it as it's needed to be designed in terms of solving and addressing the real problem. The other thing that's really important to think about, we had to make a critical decision up front, whether to go out to off-the-shelf vendors to give us various solutions. We opted not to do that, and we opted to go with a customizable framework to deal with our own issues for two important reasons that I would also encourage the task force to think about. Number one, when you go through the normal procurement process in government, you usually end up with the lowest bid by one vendor at a point in time. They sell you a system, and then that's it. And you can have these development and update agreements where they'll come in and do things for new fixed costs, but you can't make adjustments on the fly, right? I'm building a system. We have 4 coders in the building. So we're able to constantly tool and retool and redevelop this all the time. In other words, we follow a model that the private sector and the rest of the world works on, because if you think about it, no one has an iPhone in their pocket that they bought in 2010 or 2012 or 2014. Because why? Because technology is always changing. So I would very much encourage you to think about a customizable solution. And the second piece is, the most important element in all of this is not the interface, it's the data. A lot of times when you allow vendors to organize your data, they hold on to it and they don't make it available to us as frontline administrators or investigators in a way that we need all the time. So it's critically important that you have access to the data to do any number of things, because not only is my primary interest in actionable real-time intelligence, but you could come back to somebody like me and say, hey, Raul, cut it this way for the trans population over this period of time in these, but I only want to look at these 3 counties. And as long as that's built into the data sharing agreements that are hammered out at the outset, we can turn that over to epidemiologists, health specialists, education specialists, and things like that. One of the benefits that we have is that almost all of our law enforcement information is open source if it's in police reports. So we can share it with you in a variety of different ways. You just have to tell us what's of interest to you.
Thank you. We have a couple more questions.
Sure.
Go ahead, Beata.
Thank you. Thank you for this information and sharing this knowledge about the data. I have kind of a 3-part question. I'm really interested in this topic you're bringing up about symmetry and asymmetry, and looking at data and asymmetry as a response to crime and criminals. How can we integrate data around the disparities that is at the root cause of this asymmetry with like tribal communities, thinking about links to systemic poverty, to education, to lack of resources in tribal lands, and showing like how that is also intersecting with the data work. And if you can speak on that a little bit, and then also just still thinking about info we learned from the last year around activation of like VAWA in tribal communities, and how is there some kind of tools that you've thought about for like maybe like checklists or toolkits around what we need to collaborate resources between tribal communities so that we can start to prosecute and have these kind of seamless continuity, like you're talking about, that like crime networks have with each other, and like how can agencies work with each other in that same way? Sure.
So that's an excellent question. And most of the time when I make the presentation, most folks in the audience don't necessarily make that very clear connection. What you just made is the strategy that we are talking about is actually something that has applications beyond law enforcement. So if you'll remember, I showed this about prioritizing targeted interventions, right? And I gave you this screenshot of, this is Albuquerque Police Department data. But to your point, this could very easily be health data. This could be 911 calls. This could be truancy data. It could be data from a variety of different governmental institutions. And right now, New Mexico Appleseed is working to try and create a framework to share data across multiple systems, because one of the points that I make a lot when I'm talking about this in Albuquerque is exactly about root causes. Most of our root causes of crime, folks tend to talk about addiction, and they talk about substance abuse disorder. I tend to look at addiction and substance abuse disorder of symptoms of underlying adverse childhood experiences and early childhood trauma. And what I have always encouraged people to think about is that if you could layer the data about 911 calls for service and truancy calls and police calls, and you brought it all into one framework, you could actually look at these, you could probably identify the, 5,000 households in the city of Albuquerque that are consuming an inordinate share of health resources and education resources and public safety resources. And what you could do is, rather than waiting for an emergency to happen and dispatching the police or dispatching healthcare workers, you could actually dispatch an education navigator or a healthcare navigator to prevent and mitigate whatever crisis was occurring in that household. That same kind of layering of data across multiple agencies within a community has enormous power to reveal to policymakers, both within the community but across the state, disparities in access to resources, both whether they're public safety resources or education or healthcare resources. So this has clear applications beyond just the narrow view of whether a crime has occurred and what affirmative steps we can take. But this is, I guess the larger takeaway is that there's a lot of hidden data and power in the information that exists within a community and across the institutions that serve it. But if it's not organized in a way that it can be readily accessed by policymakers, you can't bring about real positive change.
All right. Thank you, Beata, for that question. That was a really great explanation there. The last question we have is from Zoe McKenzie.
Hello, this is Zoe McKenzie. I am the Area Injury Prevention Specialist with Indian Health Services for the Navajo area. My question is, I really enjoyed your presentation on the data and linking the different types of data and all the visualizations that you created for the data. And I was just wondering if you had a code book or a coding manual available for your data system, so that, you mentioned earlier about technical assistance for tribal nations for maybe building something similar. And I think the coding manual would be a first step in that direction.
So that's an excellent question. Unfortunately, we are so engaged in building and developing and refining new tools that we haven't actually taken the next step of putting it into a transferable sort of manual that can be shared outside of the agency. But one of the reasons that we wanted to establish the Cultivating Coders program underneath this data platform is so that we could start building that capacity in the next generation. So we're actively trying to recruit about 20 kids to follow along in this process. And there would be an educational component where they would meet with senior data specialists and others. I will tell you that they're going to be working with some folks that there's probably some intellectual property around. We certainly, as a governmental agency, have no problem sharing the code that we work on, but there may be some intellectual property with some of our partners. But right now, it's a pretty open environment. On Saturdays, before COVID hit, we used to have these hackathons where we would have coders come from Sandia National Labs. They'd come into the building, they'd sit with our people, they'd write code, they'd build tools, and they'd kind of do this free flow creation session. And then they would take whatever tools they felt were in a position that they might take to a next level of development. They would set those aside and develop them. But we are certainly hoping to capture some of that and build it into a curriculum for our Cultivating Coders program, which I think is going to have a real powerful impact, because there are kids right now that are coming straight out of high school. They're bypassing college, and some of them are working and getting great job opportunities because they're just going right to the forefront of this coding an information technology revolution. And frankly, there's no reason that opportunity can't be shared with every community in the state. So building out that curriculum side of things would certainly aid in this. But also providing technical assistance to communities that need it. I mean, I would imagine that there's going to be a lot of communities that if they were willing to do this, even if they signed an information and data sharing agreement, they don't have the capacity. So one of the things we would probably need to do is figure out what sources of revenue, tribal, federal, or state, could come and support the buying of servers, the deployment of, is it a broadband issue? Is it, what are the issues that are impacting our ability to get access to this information? And you would come up with an entire budget and apply for, for example, we got federal grant money to pay for the integration of some of these databases at DPS. We can take the lead on that. Some of it has been through straight direct state appropriations. We can take advantage of that. And some of it has been purely with private partnerships. And so what we try to do is figure out what the problem is, come up with the solution, and then attack that from various different angles. But I would imagine the task force would be well positioned to identify a variety of revenue sources to support this data integration project and the deployment of coding across the state.
Hey, I put a link to the National Violent Death Reporting System coding manual. So their coding manual, the coding manual that I'm interested in, is a reference document that usually defines cases, defines the variables when you're entering data, and then so that you can do quality assurance on the coding, and that also kind of describes the structure of the database, and and it also probably describes the analyses that you could do on the data. And I was just wondering if you had something like that available, a reference like that. And so I put a link there so you guys, I mean, if you haven't built a coding book or a coding manual for your database, this is an excellent, very, very, how would you say, exhaustive 251-page coding manual that you guys could follow. Thank you.
Sure. This is great. This is wonderful. And we will certainly share it with the coders in our building. I can tell you, we haven't done anything this precise, mostly because I'm yelling at them usually to do things faster and just build new tools. So, but I appreciate you sharing it with us, and it's certainly something we hope to do.
All right, excellent questions. Thank you, Zoe, for that. One question I have, District Attorney Torres, is, I know that right now the unit is specific to Bernalillo County, but is there a way, or is there some thought given as to how this can extend to other district attorneys' offices throughout the state of New Mexico?
Yeah, we've actually made a presentation on data and these specific platforms to the DAs around the state. At this point, they are so focused on their own basic appropriation needs, things as simple as we need a printer, we need a car, we need another paralegal, that they haven't had, I think, the capacity to really see why this is something that they would fight for before they go and try and get an extra prosecutor. But they're all well aware of it. And what our intention is to do specifically in working with on the data integration project at DPS through that federal grant is to try to crack open access to the data that we have so that I can see into Sandoval and Valencia and other places. But this is cutting, I'll be honest with you, this is cutting edge stuff. It's not cutting edge stuff for California or Seattle where Albany is or other places, but in New Mexico, this is still relatively new territory and people are just now kind of getting comfortable with it. I think that's going to change pretty rapidly, probably in the next 5 or 6 years, if I had to project. But our theory has been to just move fast and show people what this is capable of achieving, and then hopefully the example will encourage others to open up their systems and kind of take a new strategic orientation on some of these things.
Thank you. Thank you for that answer. And I think, you know, at this time, I don't know if there's any last minute questions that anyone wants to raise before we continue on our agenda, but I just wanted to provide that opportunity. And if not, I think, Raul, where we are at right now as a task force, our data subcommittee will be meeting on Thursday, and I imagine there's going to be a lot of discussion about the presentation you provided. You know, perhaps if you or Mr. Mendez want to participate in that meeting, if there are any, you know, initial questions from the task force, we can address those at that time. Otherwise, I can just send you a list and we can continue to work through this and, you know, and hopefully get to a point where we have a clear partnership moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can volunteer Adolfo primarily because he's the one that if you're going to put in the room with a lot of technical specialists and folks that really understand data, he's the one you're going to want to talk to. Anyway, he also has a clear understanding of the status of our project with tech and Sandia and our private partners. So he's well positioned to sort of answer any follow-up questions that may have arisen as a result of this presentation.
Excellent. I will forward that invite then to Mr. Mendez.
Great.
Thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it. It was an excellent presentation. I know a lot of us, it got a lot of wheels turning. So thank you so much.
Great. Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right. At this time, we'll move on our agenda and move to the subcommittee report outs. I think right now I'm going to start with the systems subcommittee, and actually I need to share my screen. So give me 1 second. But we will start with the systems subcommittee for their initial report out. Delilah, are you on?
Yes, I'm here. Good morning or good afternoon, everybody. I'm glad to see all of you here. Thank you, Stephanie. We'll wait for her screen to load and then I'll get started.
Okay, can you see that?
Yes, I can see that.
You're on mute, Stephanie. Okay.
All right, go ahead, Delilah, whenever you're ready.
So first, I'd like to say thank you to Stephanie for being the note taker for our subcommittee meeting. The systems subcommittee met on August 12th, and we went through the spreadsheet that was also developed and provided to us by Stephanie and IAD, and tried to, really look at before we identified short-term, long-term, or midterm goals, look at the resources that were available and any kind of information that the subcommittee believed was necessary for us to move forward. One of the things on our list was that a recommendation that has come through was to, establish sort of a more permanent MMIWR task force in New Mexico. And so, as many of us know, recently Minnesota established a task force, and they have sort of a standing office and standalone office in that state to address MMIWR in their state. And so one of the things that, and they were appropriated a certain amount of money to sort of get that off the ground. So one of the things that the systems subcommittee, in terms of identifying what resources we could use, was to request a presentation from that particular agency, so that, it could sort of help us, help inform us, and sort of help us identify, sort of next steps that the task force needed to take in order to, if that was going to be, the sort of the overarching goal or the long-term goal for the task force, to help us, determine how we can make that come to fruition in New Mexico. The other thing that was sort of on our list of recommendations was to approach and advocate for the different tribal entities throughout New Mexico to establish or adopt human trafficking codes within their jurisdictions. We do know that Navajo Nation, for example, as Stephanie has noted on the screen, has adopted their own anti-human trafficking legislation back in 2017. We also, through the Attorney General's office, who also has its own human trafficking unit, and is available to provide that kind of technical assistance to those jurisdictions. We discussed sort of using both as resources to look at and, sort of determine, how they would be helpful in us approaching jurisdictions and advocating for this type of code to exist within those respective jurisdictions. One of the biggest discussions I think that we had during the systems subcommittee meeting was the process for law enforcement officers, both tribal, state, and federal law enforcement officers, to be cross-commissioned or to have some of the to be recognized, I guess, within each other's jurisdictions, particularly for purposes of carrying out investigations or requesting certain information. One of the things that was identified in our recommendations was that, not necessarily that there may be a lack of process, but that the process as outlined isn't necessarily being followed. And, looking to what the task force can do to sort of help, make that a better process, and who people can contact and look forward or to contact and ask for assistance from in, either making the process more clear or just coming up with steps to, how we do that. And for me, at least, for someone who doesn't have a law enforcement background, it was particularly interesting to know that there are all these different things that law enforcement officers utilize in order to be either cross-commissioned or recognized as federal law enforcement agents or whatever it is. And, hearing from the experience of the law enforcement officers that we have on our particular subcommittee was definitely very, not only informational, but I also think helpful in understanding exactly what the processes are, and also in helping us, figuring out, not only points of contact, but, with their help, how we could, if we were to pursue something, for example, one of the things that we have on our recommendations list is to pass legislation regarding tribal law enforcement officers, and if they go through the process getting that same recognition as state or federal law enforcement officers, how we would go about doing that, and understanding that maybe one doesn't necessarily equate with the other, that there are additional steps that, so it was just very, I think, fulfilling in that sense to really learn from, the experience and the background that the law enforcement officers on our subcommittee have. The other thing that we learned in terms of cross-commissioning was that there is law in Arizona which allows tribal law enforcement officers to be automatically commissioned with the state if they're federally certified, and sort of looking to that process and seeing, exactly how it's utilized, whether or not it can be helpful, in New Mexico, whether or not, something like that is even, New Mexico has the capability or the interest in developing that sort of thing. All of this in terms of, addressing the issue of MMIWR in New Mexico. And, as a District Attorney Torres said, to borrow from his presentation, in identifying and sort of taking action in real time and whether or not the cross-commissioning process would be helpful in moving that along. Sort of the last thing I think that we discussed, or one of the last things that we discussed, was reaching out to the New Mexico Law Enforcement Academy to look at their training requirements and challenges regarding a commissioning model that would mirror something like Arizona's. You know, again, with the help of the law enforcement officers that we have on our particular subcommittee, you know, they were very helpful in sort of pointing out that, you know, certification in one area doesn't necessarily mean that you can be, you know, certified for purposes of, you know, another, for another purpose, or particularly in this case that, you know, qualifications for a state office, for a state police officer may not be, those qualifications may not necessarily be the same for the New Mexico Sheriff's Department. And, you know, we would need to have those conversations to see, because, and that's just because the Sheriff's Department is under DPS, and I think the state police is under the Law Enforcement Academy. And so there's just those issues I think that we need to address and kind of be more informed on before we can really, you know, move forward with taking action on some of the recommendations. The last sort of thing that we discussed was on our recommendations list was to, you know, figure out a process or develop a process regarding recognition of tribal law enforcement and tribal law enforcement. Let me back up a little bit, I'm talking too fast. One of the last things we discussed was the enforcement of orders of protection. Not only orders of protection that exist or that have been granted by, you know, state jurisdictions, but also law enforcement or orders of protection that have been granted in tribal jurisdictions, and how those can be recognized in one jurisdiction. For example, if a state court issues an order of protection for New Mexico, will that automatically be recognized within a tribal jurisdiction, or vice versa? So one of the things that we did discuss was, you know, an effort that was put forward by the New Mexico State Tribal Judicial Consortium it's been more than a couple of years, but back in 2007, called Project Passport, which specifically dealt with that sort of enforcement issue. And, you know, looking at that to see how we can use that moving forward if recognition of orders of protection in jurisdictions continues to be an issue. You know, how do we use Project Passport or advocate for both tribes in the state to give that same recognition to each of their respective orders of protection. So it was a pretty full meeting, and I think we covered a lot. We walked away with, you know, individuals and groups, you know, having to carry out, you know, some of the responsibilities and make contact with other agencies. And we have a meeting upcoming next week, I believe. So, you know, we're looking forward to continuing the conversation and really bringing back, I think, more, not only just general information, but substantive information on how a lot of the recommendations that we've been tasked with, you know, can be carried out and brought to fruition. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Delilah. Any questions for the systems subcommittee? I did see in the chat, Kathy with BIA is willing to give us some contact information for the Minnesota Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Relatives Office. So I think that's excellent. We can perhaps arrange to have them speak at our next task force meeting to really help us think through this concept of having an office dedicated to this work and what other states have done. But are there any other questions at this time before we move on to the data subcommittee? Okay, sounds good. Thank you so much, Chair Tenorio. Appreciate your report out, and we'll now go over to the data subcommittee. Chastity, I believe Deputy Chief Taft had to step away, so I think you're our presenter today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Can everybody hear me? Yay. Is anybody getting like that? You know, your energy is going low because it's after lunch, getting tired. Recenter yourself. The data committee had started off immediately. We started off with just looking at our Excel spreadsheet and kind of answering, you know, I assigned everybody to do some homework. And what I did was I assigned everybody to work on section A and E and to, you know, bring back some feedback, some questions that they had and concerns, and then their knowledge as well. And I got a pretty good group here. So I'm really proud of each and every one of them. And I want to thank them for their patience and time with working with me. And one thing we did address was a lot about our NCIC, how the database works. And Regina was kind enough to give us a whole entire rundown of that and how the clearinghouse gives us an overview and how they created a mechanism that connects with the NCIC and how they enter the data report of a person when they are missing. So with that, you know, with Delegate Amber had brought in a really good perspective and a good point of having to redesign that and to add entering tribal affiliation. And that is one thing, you know, when entering the data, that is one thing that is missing, that we feel that even if there's a way to enter a CIB number, a tribal identity number, that would be, you know, useful. And then also we had touched base on one of our questions, which is section A and 2, and Mesky had chimed in and said that in Arizona, they do have a missing person day. And then at that event, they provide booths and services, and they collect information. And also they update families that have missing people, come and update any information, ask for updates. And then they also just enter all this in the system. And I think that is a really good idea. And, you know, to request a presentation done from Dustin Driscoll. And I don't know if Mesky, if you had gotten an update on that about doing a presentation for the entire group and to establish a missing persons day for New Mexico.
Yeah, hi, hello everyone. I did get an email back this morning for Dustin. I'm not too sure, but the individual that was the one who created Missing in Arizona, he actually got a hold of me this morning. His name is Detective Stuart Summershoe with the Phoenix Police Department. And he is willing to do a presentation. So maybe we can talk a little bit more about when, where, who he needs to contact so he can get all that information set up so he can do his presentation. But he is definitely willing, and he thinks it's a great idea for New Mexico to have it. But if you guys don't know what I'm talking about, you can look on YouTube or Facebook and look up Missing in Arizona. It usually happens for every year around October. And Detective Summershoe has been at this. He collects the DNA. He has NamUs, he has a representative from NamUs there. He's got booths of resources from all different people, different organizations, and it all, you know, all collaborates together to help families and just the community itself. He was really nice enough to invite some of the families from New Mexico to come in on those days, and he did take the time out to help them get their relatives entered into NamUs. If they had dental records they wanted to add, if they wanted to add any kind of updated information. You know, when a family's in distress at the time when they're making the reports, they don't have all their thoughts together. They don't have all the information, but that day gives them that enough time to collect all that and bring it while they can update their cases. And also, it also welcomes families who haven't made a report. It welcomes them to come in and do so. So, but he is willing to do a presentation, and we can get together and talk about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mesky. I appreciate you doing that. And we spent a lot of time just really familiarizing ourselves how the clearinghouse and the NCIC was connected along with Navajo Nation. Delegate Amber Crotty had presented a few aspects from that, which gave us a clear mind of how everything is connected, and how it's overlapping, and to also to be able to address some of the pieces that need to be updated and to fix a little bit of the kinks so that we can add the tribal affiliation as well. And I'm not sure if let's see, let me go back to my notes. Sorry about that. If Representative Herndon is here today to give us an update as well.
Hi, Chastity. Representative Herndon is not here today, but she did send an email just a few minutes ago.
Okay.
She did speak with Congresswoman about the legislation. I think she'll be able to provide more of a report out on Thursday, but she didn't, that's what she included in her email. Thank you.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you. All right, does anybody have any questions for us? That's what we have right now to present. We are meeting this Thursday on the 2nd. And we're gonna go more into our questions as well as figuring out our next steps. I'm trying to, yeah, that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Chastity. I just wanted to bring your attention, Secretary Trujillo really liked the recommendation about a missing persons day for New Mexico. So I think that's a great recommendation and something we can explore further. At this time, I want to turn it over to the system subcommittee, or excuse me, the community impact subcommittee. And we have our two chairs present, Beata and Maddie Jim. But we also wanted to have Darlene Gomez present the update from the committee because there were some obligations that prevented our chairs from participating in our first meeting. So Darlene, if you wouldn't mind presenting for the group today, we would greatly appreciate it.
Thank you. My name is Darlene Gomez, and I'm going to present today on behalf of the Community Impact Subcommittee. One of the issues that we all talked about was the need for money, the need for inclusion of everyone, and the buy-in of all the different Indian tribes. We talked about reaching out to the New Mexico Behavioral Health Collaboration to identify their goals and objectives to see if anything aligns with what we're trying to do. Secondly, we would like to make a request to the ABA to start a division that deals with MMIWR issues and allowing an attorney pro bono to assist families with navigating the system. And we could also talk to the New Mexico Indian Bar law section to see if that might be something they're interested in. We would also like the state to assist families by establishing a fund to provide financial assistance to families searching for missing relatives. Oftentimes, families are having to do GoFundMe pages. They're having to have food sales and to just really talk to their community about assisting them in finances. We also believe that developing a training for shelter staff with support from the Transgender Resource Center is really important. We would also like to work with PED to develop curriculum on recognizing dangerous situations and internet safety classes for youth. And that can start at the very primary levels, kindergarten on up, and then as the children get older, then we can identify more specific curriculum for them. To also work with the state and Department of Health for a PSA campaign on awareness, prevention of sexual violence, domestic violence, and bullying. We would also like to be able to train employees at places where trafficking occurs, such as hotels, gas stations, rest stops, and gambling facilities. We would also like to establish intergenerational programming with a focus on creating a healthy relationships and talking circles with our elders. If anyone has any questions, please let me know and I will try to assist in answering them. Thank you.
Thank you, Darlene.
Hello, Darlene. Oh, sorry. Hi, Darlene. This is Michelle. I'm also on the community impact committee subcommittee. I haven't been in the meetings because I was transitioning to another organization, but I love how you mentioned we should train employees at places where trafficking occurs. And I have a lot of experience with that as formerly being a direct service provider. So I can take that role in helping everyone, you know, kind of like forming a street outreach team. So we can target where traffickings are more likely to occur. So I like how you put that in there and how you mentioned to establish funding for financial assistance to families because it takes a toll on everyone. But yes, so that's all I wanted to mention. Thank you, Darlene.
Thank you. I also wanted to just open it up. If other members of the Community Impact Subcommittee wanted to elaborate on any of these specific recommendations, you're welcome to. And I do apologize. I intended to provide a little bit more context about what these report outs and the work that the subcommittees have been doing up front, but to kind of backtrack a little bit, we did provide each subcommittee with the 2020 final report recommendations from the MMIWR report for the state of New Mexico. And we asked them to start identifying some specifics about how can this recommendation get carried out? What are some ways, some action items to put behind this recommendation? And so the report out today is not a comprehensive list of action items, but it is the initial, I think, just some highlights from the discussion, some areas that there was a lot of excitement around, a lot of discussion. So that is what is being presented today.
This is Maddie. There's one thing I wanted to add around the discussion and the work that we're doing in our subcommittee is around like the peer support work that's being done, and we're seeing a lot of that. And I think we had a discussion around how with peer support coming from another peer, that gives them more of a push for somebody to initiate services or get services or even speak about like the topics that we're talking about.
Thank you, Maddie. Any other, anything else from the Community Impact Subcommittee?
This is Beata. I would just like to also encourage us to work with, I know we do have some youth representatives on the task forces here, so the piece on developing curriculum, we should definitely work with the youth on the task force and see what other points we can make.
That's great. I think that is something we can maybe invite someone from the public education department to also maybe explore that a little bit more, to think about what will it take to have some type of curriculum developed. And if it's not PED, maybe it is another educational organization that we can partner with on that specific recommendation. All right. So thank you, subcommittee chairs and members, for contributing during this report out. I didn't give any of the other subcommittees an opportunity to speak up, but if there are task force members that want to add anything, or if anything has come up during this report out that you'd like to share at this time, feel free to jump in, raise your hand, but I'm going to continue on with our agenda and move on to announcements. So just a few things I wanted to flag for our task force and our members. We have some important dates that are coming up that will impact our work, but I want to highlight this for you all, that on October 1st, our department is scheduled to present before the Legislative Health and Human Services Committee, Interim Committee, as well as the Interim Indian Affairs Committee. And so at that time, we do want to be able to provide some update on our work. Perhaps at that point, if there are recommendations that we can share, I think it would be a good time to provide a snapshot maybe of some of the recommendations that we feel strongly about. And so I think in addition to that, at the end of October, there will also be a second Interim Indian Affairs Committee meeting, and that'll give us a second opportunity to present to the committee. And so specifically on the MMIW work. So I think we have 2 committee meetings in October, 2 opportunities to share with our legislators some of the work that we're doing and some of the key recommendations that are starting to unfold through the subcommittee discussion. So just please keep that in mind as you meet in the next couple of weeks, that we do have this opportunity coming up. And if we need to get on a planning call to kind of strategize this a little bit more, we're happy to do that with on behalf of the department and our staff. The other thing I wanted to mention, I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but we do have a partnership this semester with the Southwest Indian Law Clinic. Chastity, earlier in the presentation, you had some ideas about tribal codes and what type of codes need to be developed or are lacking that would serve survivors that are, where do we need to focus our attention when it comes to tribal code development? And so I think, that's one thing that Silk might be able to look at, but specifically one of the initial tasks that we were hoping that they could start looking at is what Delilah presented during the systems subcommittee presentation about really looking at the Arizona commissioning model and thinking about how that can be replicated here in New Mexico, and what are some of the barriers and obstacles to getting something like that in place. And so we tasked them with that assignment, but it's by no means final, and we can always, if there are other needs that we want Silk to address, we can always shift their scope of work a little bit. But we'll be meeting with them tomorrow, actually, and they'll start working with the task force and hopefully joining some of your subcommittee meetings in the next couple weeks. So here for members of the public and also our task force, these are the upcoming meeting schedule. So data subcommittee will be meeting on September 2nd from 1 to 3. And then our system subcommittee will be meeting next Thursday from 1 to 4. And our community impact, we will be sending out a survey today so we can determine what that regular scheduled meeting time will be for the remainder of the year. So just keep a lookout for that, and we'll I think what we can start doing is posting these times on our MMIWR clearinghouse. So please keep an eye out for that. And that's where we'll have the public notices. So if the public wants to attend, you're more than welcome to. And finally, before we wrap up, I just wanted to identify, an assignment here for our subcommittee chairs, going back to the announcement that I made earlier about the Interim Indian Affairs Committee meeting. At your next meeting, if you and your committee members can start thinking about any legislative proposals that we might be able to present during the Interim Indian Affairs Committee, I think that would be excellent. We know that at this point, a lot of these are still ideas and there's a lot of questions and research that might be needed. I would say at this point, just outline all of that. And if you can send those proposals to Secretary Trujillo by Friday, September 17th, that'll give us 2 weeks to work with you to try and get these cleaned up a little bit so that we have something to present on October 1st at that first committee meeting. And then if we need more time, I think that's a good opportunity for the task force to get feedback from the various legislative committee members so that we can, bring that back to the group and think about those legislative proposals. This isn't the final opportunity. I think we just, our legislators, our lawmakers, they're working on a different schedule. And I know we have some lawmakers here. Representative Lewis was participating and so is Senator Lopez. So, I don't know if you have anything to add to that or if you would like to say anything with respect to this. But, that is essentially what we're hoping to do, is to have something prepared by that next meeting. And I'm willing to work with all of the chairs to kind of meet this assignment and request. So with that, are there any questions at this time related to that assignment or any of the announcements? All right, great. Well, I think that's it for this presentation. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Let's see. At this point, Mesky did share some of that information about the Missing in Arizona Day. But at this point, I think we are ready to close the meeting. And I just wanted to turn it over again to Jose Viejas, Chaplain Viejas, to close our meeting today.
We close in the name of the Creator, Creator of the universe, of all we know. We give thanks for this day. From the direction of sunrise, the blue corn mother, newness, renewal, and new beginning. From the direction of the north, the place of ice, the great tundra, white corn mother, we give thanks for wisdom. From the direction of the west, the place of ancestors, yellow corn mother, we remember all of those who have gone before us, and we honor their memory now. Let us draw peace and strength in knowing their spirits are with us this day. From the direction of the south, the place of warmth and love, red corn mother, let us remember to love one another as the Creator loves us. From the direction of within, may we daily walk in beauty. Beauty before me, beauty behind me, beauty above me, beauty below me. May all around be beauty. We offer to you, Creator of the universe, Chikote Otesa, and blessings to each one of you. Amen.
Thank you. Thank you, Chaplain. Really appreciate that. Everyone be well today. Thank you for your participation and the good energy you brought to this room. And we'll be in touch soon with more information. Everyone take care.